Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Couple quick announcements. First of all, Erica, our TA, is here today at the back, so you know what she looks like. I'm hoping, praying that we can get like a second TA or at least somebody to help us with grading. The negotiations with the Biostatistics department are at a very delicate phase right now. If anyone's not registered, please register because it will help me get leverage so that Erica and I don't have to do all the grading ourselves. And the other quick announcement is that I think I successfully posted Wednesday's lecture to YouTube. It only involved about 4 hours of fighting with PowerPoint. Really glad that I spent all those years in school so that I know how to do that, but I think I succeeded. So if anybody watches it, let me know if it actually worked. Given that class is smaller today, maybe that's a sign that it did, but anyway, I did not watch the whole thing to verify that it worked correctly, so. Okay, anyway, on to today's lecture where pretty much the first 2 weeks of this class are going to be focused primarily on experimental design because, as I said, it may be the most important thing we do all semester. You can always look up how to do a test or get someone to help you, but if there's a fundamental problem with the way your experiment's set up, there's really no way to recover from that. So today we're going to discuss controlled experiments, particularly like randomized controlled double-blind experiments, which are kind of the holy grail of experimental design, considered superior to all other designs, but a lot of times we can't do it for various reasons. So today I'll describe why it's important to do controlled experiments and how to do one properly. If you use the Samuel and Whitmer book at all, this is chapter 8, I believe. Oh, in contrast to a rigorous controlled experiment, sort of the extreme in the other direction is what's known as anecdotal evidence, which anecdotal evidence is basically a story or an example of some kind of event, and it's often highly unreliable. To give an example of how anecdotes can be unreliable, particularly in light of scientific evidence, one example is prayer. You can have many people have told stories of people who've made miraculous recoveries after prayer. You can even find doctors who report things like this. But one still might ask, well, the human mind is a fallible thing. It likes to detect patterns when patterns aren't actually there. Can we show rigorously whether or not prayer actually works? So they tried to design a more rigorous experiment to test the power of prayer. It involved 1,800 heart surgery patients who were examined over the course of a decade. And basically, there were a couple parts of this experiment. For one part of the experiment, they just randomly assigned half of the people to have strangers pray for them. The other half of the people didn't get any kind of intercessory prayer. In that particular phase of the experiment, there was no difference between those who received prayers and those who didn't. In another part of the experiment, they told them whether they were being prayed for or not, and in that particular hunk of the experiment, those who knew that they were the recipients of intercessory prayer actually had higher incidence of complications than those who didn't. So, as I said, human brain oftentimes finds patterns, even spurious patterns, hence anecdotal evidence is unreliable, and scientifically you're always better off to systematically compare two groups using an experiment. I'll start by going over some terminology both for today and for the course generally. I know this is quite a bit of stuff coming at you at once, but hopefully most of it you've seen before at some point in your life. When you talk about an experiment, the term sometimes gets used a bit sloppily and can mean various different things, but usually an experiment implies that you're actively intervening or manipulating the experimental condition so that you can compare one group to another, whereas an observational study means that you don't actively intervene, you just observe data that's already out there and then try to draw inferences based on that observation. And generally speaking, experiments are more reliable than observational studies, but sometimes observational studies are still valuable if you can't do an experiment because it would be too expensive or it would be unethical or both. Like, classic example of this would be smoking and lung cancer. One of the reasons that the tobacco industry denied for so long that smoking causes lung cancer is because there never has been a rigorously controlled experiment in humans showing that smoking causes lung cancer. To do that, you would have to just like get a group of people hooked on cigarettes at a young age, another group not hooked on cigarettes at a young age, and follow them for about 30 or 40 years. Aside from the fact that that would be extremely expensive, it's also considered highly unethical to addict people to something that could kill them. Hence, we have to rely on observational data. But if you can do an experiment, generally you should do an experiment. And some of the terminology, both in experiments and for the rest of this course, a response variable, or sometimes called an outcome variable, would be the outcome of interest in your experiment. And say like the smoking and lung cancer thing, your outcome variable would be whether or not a person develops lung cancer. Explanatory or predictor variable would be a variable used to predict an outcome. Obviously, whether or not they smoke, you could also look at things like diet, exercise, family history, things like that. And a confounding variable is a variable, or an extraneous variable, more commonly a confounding variable, is a variable may affect the results but isn't of direct interest. Like taking smoking and lung cancer again, for a long time the tobacco industry tried to claim, well, it isn't smoking that causes lung cancer, there's probably some gene that makes people highly nervous or something like that, and that gene makes them more likely to smoke and more likely to develop lung cancer, but one isn't directly causing the other. And in observational data, that's really difficult possibility to rule out. Even in an experiment, that's difficult to rule out. We'll briefly discuss in a future lecture how you can try to show that A causes B and isn't the result of some invisible confounding variable, but in general it's difficult to prove. And observational units, or sometimes more simply subject, is just basically whatever you're studying. It could be the people in your observational study on lung cancer. It could be rats that you're injecting with some toxin, or whatever other thing you might be studying. So, a good portion of today's lecture I'm going to talk about the Salk polio vaccine because it's a nice illustration of a lot of the things that go into good experimental design. Explain how the trial for this particular vaccine was performed and why it was performed that way, and the types of trouble you can get into if you don't follow the ideal design. Oh, polio first hit the U.S. in 1916. It killed hundreds of thousands of people at its peak. In the 1950s, finally Jonas Salk developed a vaccine, and it raised the obvious question, well, does this vaccine actually do anything? They wanted to conduct an experiment to see if we could save lives by doing this vaccine. So how's the best way to perform this particular experiment? Well, first thing that you have to do when designing an experiment that hopefully most of you knew already, but worth pointing out, you need to have controls. At first glance, if you haven't been exposed to experimental design, you might think, well, we've got hundreds of thousands of young children dying from this vaccine. We want to save as many lives as possible. We should just give the vaccine to everyone. Well, what if the vaccine doesn't do anything, in which case we're wasting a lot of money? What if the vaccine's actually harmful? It causes kids to develop polio or puts them at increased risk for other diseases. The only way to know if the vaccine's actually producing a positive effect is to compare it to people who aren't getting the vaccine. So one might think, well, okay, we could still just vaccinate all the kids and let's just compare the death rate from polio from one year to the next year. Well, then time becomes a strong confounding variable. Because polio is an epidemic disease, the death rate can vary drastically from one year to the next. You see on the slide here, there were 60,000 deaths in 1952. 1953, before the vaccine was even released to the public, the death rate dropped in half. So if you suddenly vaccinated all the kids in 1953, you might think that the vaccine was having wonderful effects, even if it was doing absolutely nothing. So it isn't sufficient to just compare it from one year to another. You need to do controls such that the controls are as similar as possible to those who are receiving the treatment. So, a little bit more terminology, which is bordering on an insult to your intelligence, but I will put it out there just for the sake of completeness. If you get the treatment, then you are said to be in the treatment group. If you don't get the treatment, you're control, then you're in the control group. I mean, I know, wow, who would have thought? Okay. So, next question is, how do you choose your controls? When you're doing a vaccine trial for polio, you need to get consent from the parents in order to administer the vaccine. So one might think, well, we don't want to throw any of these kids out of our sample just because their parents wouldn't give consent. Let's just take the kids whose parents gave consent and to be in the treatment group, the kids whose parents didn't give consent to be in the control group. That will maximize the number of kids who gets the vaccine. Also means that we won't lose any data. Well, it turns out that's a suboptimal approach because it's another source of confounding. Higher income parents are more likely to give consent than lower income parents, and somewhat surprisingly, lower income kids tended to have lower rates of polio than higher income kids. It's believed that's the result that a lot of times lower income children often grow up in somewhat unsanitary conditions. As a result, end up acquiring mild cases of polio at a very young age, so then they develop immunity and don't develop more severe forms of polio when they're older. So if we use that experimental design, it would potentially create a bias against the vaccine because the children in the control group would have lower rates of polio than children in the treatment group. So in general, when you choose your controls, you want them to be as similar to the treatment group as possible. You want the only difference to be the treatment itself. So, and there are other ways you can do this. One approach that actually was used in this polio trial was an experiment performed by the National Foundation for Infant Paralysis that proposed the following design: that you vaccinate all the children in grade 2 whose parents consent, and then you leave grades 1 and 3 as controls. And I mean, this isn't horrible. I mean, in this case, the Salk vaccine did reduce the incidence of polio enough that despite some flaws with the experimental design, it still gave the correct results. But this particular design leaves open certain possible forms of confounding. For one thing, this can lead to bias. You end up with too many children of high-income parents in the treatment group because all of grades 1 and 3 got put in the control group, both low-income and high-income kids, whereas the treatment group was biased towards higher-income kids who had higher polio rates. And it introduced some other possible confounding variables as well. That polio is a contagious disease that's spread through contact. So it could be that a couple kids in 2nd grade get polio, spread it to their entire class. This happens in enough schools across the country, and that could create bias against the vaccine. Or it could be this happens in grade 1, in which case it introduces bias in favor of the vaccine. So there's at least 2 potential major confounding variables it introduces, and maybe it's more. Perhaps kids in 1st grade are more susceptible generally than kids in 2nd grade. Then that would create a 3rd confounding variable. So, I mean, it isn't horribly catastrophically wrong. The point's going to give you completely invalid results, but there is some potential bias here, as we'll see in a couple slides. A better design is a completely randomized design where the children are chosen from the exact same where the controls are chosen from the exact same population as the treatment group, namely those whose parents gave consent. So basically, the idea is if a parent doesn't give consent, the child doesn't even make it into the study. They're excluded completely. You might say that's horrible, we're wasting data, but as it turns out that a lot of times in statistical analysis, you don't need a huge sample size to produce the results that you want, and you may be able to get away with a smaller data set. On the other hand, if there's a confounding variable in your analysis that you don't adjust for, I mean, you were just absolutely dead in the water. It doesn't matter if you have a sample of size 1,000,000, you can still get incorrect results. In fact, that's not entirely hypothetical. I'll talk about this more in a later lecture, but there was a famous example in 1936. A major magazine called the Literary Digest sent around these questionnaires to its subscribers saying, who are you going to vote for president? And they came back with the result that Alf Landon was going to beat FDR in a landslide. It's kind of like, oops. It was basically they had a biased sample. The people who subscribed to the Literary Digest had much more money than the general population at the time and hence were much more Republican. So getting a representative sample in your experiment is absolutely essential. It's much better to have a smaller unbiased sample than a larger biased sample in almost all situations. And so, in this case, we just exclude anyone whose parents don't give consent to avoid that potential confounding variable. And among those whose parents do give consent, you just flip a coin. Heads, they go to the treatment group. Tails, they go to the control group, basically. I mean, in practice, you wouldn't really flip a coin. You'd probably do this with a computer or something like that. But you would want to make the assignment to treatment group and control group completely at random. And the reason that you do that is because if you're doing it randomly, it becomes extraordinarily unlikely that you're going to end up with all the rich kids in one group and all the poor kids in the other group, or you're going to have all men in one group and all women in the other group, or something like that. I mean, it's theoretically possible, but it becomes increasingly unlikely as the size of your sample increases. So, generally speaking, it ensures that your 2 groups are going to be comparable to one another. And the next aspect of experimental design is the importance of placebos. You might think, okay, well, this is easy enough. We have a treatment group and a control group. We'll give polio shots to the treatment group. We won't give polio shots to the control group, and we'll see if the treatment group has lower incidence rates of polio. It turns out that's a bad experimental design because the human brain is a really remarkable thing that sometimes we will get better if you give us sugar pills or inject us with water or do other phony treatments. This is a phenomenon known as the placebo effect. And this slide I pulled off of Wikipedia, so take it for what it's worth, but they did give references to scientific publications for all of these. These are all the different diseases that have been shown to improve if you treat them with a placebo. And some of them, pain, okay, fine, that's not shocking. That if you think you're taking a painkiller, even if you're not actually taking one, that if you might think that you're getting better, but I mean, some of them are a little bit stranger, like binge eating disorder apparently can be treated with placebo, or depression, or erectile dysfunction, or in some cases, even cancer has been shown to go into remission when you inject somebody with fake chemotherapy, i.e., water or something like that. Oh, it's really quite remarkable, but a point is if you give shots to children, you don't give shots to the children, you give shots to the children in the treatment group and don't give shots to the control group, that the children in the treatment group, however this mental thing works, think that they're going to be healthier and may result in a lower polio incidence rate. In fact, this is kind of a random little aside. I mean, I actually read this fascinating paper a while ago showing that the placebo effect has actually been getting stronger over time in a variety of studies. Their explanation is that the pharmaceutical industry has done such a good job of convincing us that drugs actually work that now when we get fake drugs, they work better than fake drugs did 30 years ago. I mean, our minds are really amazing, but for the purpose of experimental design, the important thing is that you always have a placebo, or at least if it's possible to do a placebo, you should. So in the case of the Salk vaccine, those in the treatment group got a live vaccine, those in the control group would get a saltwater injection or some other shot such that they couldn't tell whether they were or not they were in the treatment group or the control group. Another important aspect of experimental design that's probably less important in the bench science world just because it's difficult to do, but still worth keeping in mind, is that whenever possible, experiments should be double-blind, which means that neither the subjects nor those examining the subject should know which is in the treatment group and which is in the control group. The diagnosis of polio is somewhat subjective. If examiners know which subjects are getting the vaccine, it could bias the results. They think, okay, that can't possibly be polio. I know they were in the vaccine group, and could end up biasing it. I mean, as I said, that's in the bench science world, oftentimes designing a double-blind experiment is going to be impossible, particularly if you're doing the experiment entirely by yourself. But if there's any possible way to do it, it's a good idea. Say, if you're injecting rats with something and then measuring the growth rates 2 weeks later is one example. It would be good to have one person do the injection and somebody else who doesn't know which is in which group do the measurements, just to reduce that possibility of bias. So this slide shows the results of the randomized controlled double-blind experiment and also the NFIP design. And it looks like when part of my table got cut off when I converted this from PowerPoint to Keynote, but oh well. It's supposed to say polio cases per 100,000, I believe. But in the randomized controlled double-blind experiment, we see that the control group had much higher incidence rates of polio than the treatment group. And also worth pointing out, the group whose parents didn't give consent still had higher incidence of polio than the treatment group, but it was noticeably lower than the control groups, showing the bias that could have resulted if we included children whose parents didn't give consent in the control group. Because, like I said, these were disproportionately lower income children who tend to have lower incidence of polio. And yeah, once again, I apologize for the fact that my slide got messed up here. That's supposed to say grade, under the NFIP design, that's supposed to say grade 2, and then grades 1 and 3, and then grade 2 with no consent. And under the NFIP design, we still got the same main take-home message, namely that grade 2 that got the vaccine had lower incidence of polio than grades 1 and 3 that didn't get the vaccine, and those whose parents didn't give consent had higher incidence than those who got the vaccine, but lower incidence than those who consented and said no, but the effect sizes were much smaller because the NFIP design introduced these other confounding variables that we didn't get in the fully randomized controlled design. Now I'm going to briefly describe a couple experiments that were done incorrectly and show how that gave some potentially misleading results. First example is this drug called clofibrate, I guess is how you pronounce it. It's designed to lower cholesterol and reduce the risk of death from coronary disease. So they developed this new drug and they wanted to see if it actually worked to decrease heart disease. And in one of the preliminary trial, a lot of people didn't take all of their pills. And they saw those who took all of the pills, or at least 80% of their pills, had a 5-year mortality rate of 15%, whereas those who took less than 80% of their pills had a significantly higher mortality rate, about 25%. So you might think, wow, if people take their clofibrate like they're supposed to, that drastically reduces their risk of death from cardiovascular disease. This drug must work fairly well. Well, that's... hopefully you see already there were no controls in this particular experiment. And if you just compare those who take their pills to those who didn't take their pills, there's a major confounding variable that those who take their pills are, number one, probably more health conscious than those who don't take their pills. They're going to be the ones who are also exercising and eating the right foods and so forth. And I mean, it also may be you may not take your pills because you're getting older and having a harder time moving around or getting senile, whatever the case may be. There are plenty of reasons that if you're not taking your pills, you may already be at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Oh, if you look at the effect of clofibrate in a case control design, that the mortality rates for clofibrate are about the same as the mortality rates for those who are taking sugar pills, both for people who are taking their pills like they're supposed to and those who didn't. So it looks like it's not clofibrate that's lowering the mortality rate of people who are taking their pills. It's just these are the people who are taking care of their health generally. The moral of the story is that if you don't include controls in your experiment, you can get misleading results. Second example is the PorterCable shunt once again, that, as you'll recall from Wednesday's lecture, in some cases of cirrhosis of the liver, the patient may start to hemorrhage and potentially bleed to death, and you can try to treat that by redirecting blood through a PorterCable shunt, but this is a very difficult operation to do. Sometimes it results in patients dying as a result of the operation rather than their original bleeding. It raises the question of, do the benefits outweigh the risk? As you'll recall from Wednesday's lecture, most of the original experiments testing the efficacy of this procedure didn't include any controls, and the ones who didn't have controls thought it was great, whereas those who included controls thought it was not so great. And today, repeating that slide, but also adding this a row in the middle here showing the importance of randomization, that in addition to the set of studies that had no controls whatsoever, there were another set of 15 studies that had controls, but there was no randomization. The idea was that the doctor decided whether or not to do the shunt or not, and then they compared those who got the shunt to those who didn't get the shunt. And, well, obviously, if it's not randomized, most of the time they're going to be doing the shunt on the most difficult patients and not doing it on the less difficult patients, sort of thing. So, if anything, my intuition that would have created bias against the shunt, but it turned out to be the contrary, that apparently they just looked at the results and thought, wow, that patient was incredibly difficult, and that shunt saved his life. This shunt is a wonderful thing. There were only 4 studies where there were both controls and randomization, where each patient that was a candidate for the shunt, they just randomly determined these ones get a shunt, these ones don't. Among those that did the randomized controlled design, they found that the shunt didn't help and oftentimes made things worse. Hence, we see that a randomized controlled experiment can give you the quote-unquote true results when other experimental designs can give you potentially misleading results. And now I'll just consider a couple case studies here where you want to test the effect of a certain treatment on laboratory mice, for instance. Let's say you want to test the effect of a certain type of treatment on your mice, so you take the first 6 mice and assign them to your treatment group, the next 6 to the control group. And I mean, this experimental design isn't horrible, as I say, but it's still potentially problematic. That, number one, it's not random. You may end up picking up the 6 lowest mice first, who tend to be like the 6 least healthy mice. And it's also not double-blind because the researcher knows which mice are the controls. So, did I skip? No, I didn't skip a slide here. A more effective experimental design would be to do something where you label each mouse inside the cage, then use a computer to randomly choose the mice, and then, like I said, in the absolute perfect world, have one person administer the treatment and have a second person measure the effect of the treatment. So now going on to a different potential source of confounding. Let's say that you're doing a microarray experiment and you want to compare the effects of 2 treatments on a cell line using microarrays, and the first treatment you label with a red dye and the second treatment you label with a green dye. The problem with this approach, hopefully you see already, is that you're potentially creating bias due to the dye, that you can't tell if the differences in expression between the treatment group and the control group, or between treatment 1 and treatment 2, are due to the effects of the treatment, or if one of the dyes simply hybridizes better than the other dye, so it ends up creating the impression that expression level is higher in that particular dye just due entirely to the dye bias. And one kind of final comment on this whole thing is I always go through this whole lecture and oftentimes get responses to the first homework assignment when I put an experimental design that I think is somewhat reasonable, and others read it's like, oh, this is terrible, it's not randomized, it's not controlled, blah, blah, blah. Like I say, here I'm talking about the perfect world, that if you can do it this way, you should do it this way. But in practice, you may not always be able to do this ideal randomized control design. I always like this headline from The Onion, as you see here. It says, heart transplant group significantly healthier than heart transplant placebo group. I mean, obviously, this is satirical, but if you're testing the efficacy of heart transplant surgery, you are going to have a very difficult time convincing your IRB to let you give placebo heart transplant surgery. Thankfully, because I personally would not want to be in an experiment where I might get heart transplant placebo surgery. That, as I said, in general, randomized controlled double-blind experiment is considered to be the gold standard of experimental design. That, I mean, particularly if you're like working for a drug company and want to get your drug approved, I mean, the FDA isn't going to accept anything that's not a randomized controlled double-blind experiment. But in many situations, a randomized controlled experiment is going to be too expensive, unethical, or just too logistically difficult. As I said, that you can't do a randomized controlled experiment about open heart surgery or the effect of smoking or something like that. And in these types of situations, you just have to try to design an experiment that's as close as possible to the gold standard and just acknowledge the limitations of your experiment in the discussion section of your paper or whatever the case may be. That, I mean, I'll discuss this in more detail later on, that no, you can't do a rigorous randomized controlled experiment where you assign half the people to smoke and half the people not to smoke and see which ones get cancer. In fact, Monday's lecture will be focused entirely on observational studies and how to design those experiments and analyze them so that you don't get into trouble. I mean, just briefly, like in the case of smoking, they've done things like showing that the more you smoke, the more likely you are to get lung cancer. Or, in addition, they've shown that, like, if you administer tobacco smoke to rats, those rats are more likely to get lung cancer. Or you can do things like the idea that, like, chewing tobacco increases the risk of, like, cancer in the mouth and throat and things like that. Number of things along these lines that make it less and less likely that the association between smoking and lung cancer is due to confounding, that one actually is causing the other. But there still is perhaps some small possibility that there is some gene out there that predisposes people to both smoking and cancer, and that's a possibility that you can't rule out in a non-randomized controlled experiment. So, main things to remember for today is that when you conduct an experiment, you virtually always need some type of control group to compare it to, and you want the controls to be as similar as possible to the treatment group. I say similar as possible, particularly in observational studies. It may not be possible to directly compare a treatment group and a control group that are identical in all ways other than the treatment. I mean, smoking, once again, those who smoke are going to tend to be poorer and less health conscious for the most part, and that's a potential source of bias. But in general, you want to try to make the two groups as similar as possible. If you're looking at smoking and lung cancer, you want to find like the same geographic area with people with comparable race and socioeconomic status when you compare the two groups, and you don't compare like smokers in rural Alabama to non-smokers in New York City, for instance. And if the treatment involves giving a drug or a treatment to a live subject, then you should give a placebo to controls to avoid potential bias or confounding due to the placebo effect. And you want to try to make the assignment to the treatment control group completely at random. If you use any other criteria, it can potentially introduce bias. And if there's other potential confounding variables, like the die bias example that I talked about, you should use randomization to offset that. This is another thing that I'll discuss in more detail in a future lecture. And whenever possible, your experiments should be double-blind. Again, I mean, in the bench science world, more often than not, they won't be, but whenever possible, double-blind is a good thing. And wow. It never ceases to amaze me how I manage to give this lecture faster every single year. Anybody have any questions? If not, then I guess we're done 10 minutes early. Okay.